I heard there was dessert. I hope that you all ate some. What a terrific bunch of panels, right? So, just too much to digest in one day. So don't worry, these presentations and the videotape, of course, will be posted on our website for you all to look at your leisure. But right now it is my pleasure to introduce Leonard Jones, Managing Director in the Public Finance Group for Moody's Investor Service. He is co-manager of the local government ratings in the U.S., and he is responsible for managing the New York, Boston, and San Francisco-based local government ratings teams. Also leads Moody's Public Finance Group's efforts focusing on the environment, so all of us are interested in that today as well. We're excited to have him join us today to discuss how Moody's takes climate change impacts into account in the credit ratings process. I know many of our local governments are very interested in that, so we're excited that he could join us today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank the Virginia Coastal Policy Center for inviting me. I think it's remarkable what the center has done over the last 6-7 years that this has been going on, and we're really happy to be able to add our voice as to what's going on in relation to climate change. So what I'd like to do is give some summary background on how Moody's incorporates climate change into our credit ratings. After kind of a summary of that, hopefully I can answer some questions. So Moody's is a credit rating agency. We rate debt of both public and private sector issuers. We rate about $75 billion worth of debt for a wide range of sectors across the globe. And, ESG, particularly environmental risks, have gotten much more of a focus from us in the last few years. I think somebody mentioned that a little earlier. And this is really the reason why. It's really that first bubble on the left, the rise of sustainable investing. We provide these ratings for investors, and our investors have come to us and said they need more transparency, more understanding as to how we consider climate change risks in our credit ratings, that a lot of the money that they manage is being moved from the baby boomer generation to their kids, and these younger people care a lot more about sustainability, climate change, and they want the folks investing their money to tell them why their investments are sustainable or resilient. So we've been focusing on being much more transparent about how we consider climate change risks in our ratings. And we're doing this through kind of three aspects. One is our analytics. So we've always considered climate change in our ratings, but we were not so transparent about it, and we were not as detailed about it as we are now. So before, Hilton Head Island, they're in the middle of the ocean, they would get a lot of kind of climate change questions. Some entities in the middle of the country might not get as many. And what we've been doing is improving the metrics that we start with so that we can have a better idea of who's exposed to climate change. And then we spend a lot more time asking about it and collecting that data. And we're also producing a lot of research related to climate change. Investors want to know, we publish on climate change probably every week. We have a portal on our website that deals specifically with ESG issues. And then we're also, doing outreach. I'm here. We try to get out in the financial markets and let folks know what we think. One thing I just wanted to make sure everybody's aware of, because a lot of times we get a question as of, they must be exposed to climate change. Have you lowered their rating? And we haven't many times because credit ratings are, deal over a certain time horizon. And so we look at risks a risk such as sea level rise that may happen over 20 years, we have less clarity into that risk 20 years from now than we do a risk from a year from now. So when we kind of discount the value, you get less downward pressure or less upward pressure for something that's happening 20 years from now than something that's happening a year from now. You can't do much to change things that are happening a year from now. You can actually do things to alter the course of something that may happen in 20 years. And one thing somebody mentioned earlier is people are talking about climate change, but using different terms. So we thought that the first thing we needed to do was develop a taxonomy, develop a language that we're going to use whenever we talk about these issues that's consistent, so that investors can understand what we're saying. We don't use different words that have different meanings. For the social and governance aspects, we have different taxonomies for private companies and for public companies. For environmental, we just have one taxonomy. Environmental events don't discriminate between public sector owners or private sector owners. So those are kind of 5 of the metrics that we really look for as we created a taxonomy to look at these things. So the first thing we did after we developed a taxonomy was said, let's look at our portfolio and figure out who's most exposed to environmental risk. So we did a heat map. We actually did 2. This is the latest one we did, which came out, I don't know, earlier this year. And we looked at the 84 global sectors in which we rate, as I said, $75 trillion. And we looked at it based on those 5 subcategories in the taxonomy for environmental or climate risk. And as you probably expect, the ones that ended up at high or elevated exposure were 11 sectors that have about $2.2 trillion of debt. And those are, you know, the coal companies, the unregulated power utilities, oil and gas companies, kind of the suspects that you might have guessed would have high or elevated exposure. I know you can't read this chart, but these are all the sectors that we looked at. And the ones that most people in here are interested in, which are regional and local governments, is a low risk. It's on the green on the right over there. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we view climate change. We separate out what we call climate trends versus climate shocks. So climate trends are sea level rise, the increasing heat, increasing dryness or wetness, this kind of longer term climate events that happen. And then we look at climate shocks, which are the wildfires and hurricanes and floods and droughts, a lot of the events that are happening right now. And we believe that climate shocks and climate trends manifest themselves in physical ways. So, you know, the warming trends, you know, the air warming, the water warming, deacidification of the ocean, and the shocks that I mentioned before, the droughts, wildfires, floods. And so in the U.S., these natural disasters, these climate shocks have been increasing. I think this chart, we need to redo it because it ends in 15. And you'll see it still has high numbers going through now. When we first started working on this, we got a lot of scientists who, you know, may not believe in climate change and push back. And we always tried to take ourselves out of that and say, well, we don't know why climate change is happening. It could be CO2 emissions. It could be the natural 5,000-year evolution of things, as some people have argued. But regardless of what it is, we need to address it, or else, we'll be extinct like some of those other species several years ago. So we've really noticed that these natural disasters have become much more frequent. And the way we identify the credit risks related to climate change are here. There's economic disruption. That's one of the big factors in our credit analysis is the economy. And, how vibrant is the economy? What is it producing? Well, with climate trends, climate shocks, you end up with property loss, supply chain disruption, agricultural production declines. So there are several ways that these manifest themselves. It could be in physical damage, loss of roads, loss of buildings, loss of transportation networks. We look at health and public safety issues. People die when these events happen, and not just hurricanes, not just wildfires. When Chicago has heat over 105 degrees for a week, people generally die. So there's loss of life, there's medical care issues, and then population displacement. I think New Orleans has still not regained the population they had before Katrina happened. And we look at these risks not in a separate section. So there's no section we'll go to for a city and say, well, where's their ESG risk score? We think that environmental risk will show in traditional credit risk when there's a problem. So we think, as I mentioned before, that the economy, if there are issues with a climate shock or climate trends, it will eventually flow through the economy or flow through the finances of that local government. And so we don't look at the exposure as the same all across. There could be two entities that are next to each other that have the same exposure, and one of them's doing something about it, doing a lot about it, and the other one's not. And so we take that into consideration, what kind of mitigation or resilience plans issuers have, and talk a lot about that. So this is just an example of some of our local government scorecard. So when we do ratings, we have a methodology that goes through, public methodology that goes through how we review it. And lots of these methodologies have scorecards where we, give a certain amount of credit and, come up with numbers so we could rank people and look across entities. And so, the economy and tax base typically has about 30%. So issuers with economies concentrated in, sectors exposed to climate change face a higher credit vulnerability than those that don't. Very small economies, can be disproportionately impacted by climate events. And so they are at heightened risk. We look at that. Finances, fiscal flexibility can be challenged when you have a climate shock. And your fiscal your financial resources will determine how much flexibility you have to respond to that event or not. Management, we talk to management, and issuers that have a plan for climate events typically work out much better than issuers who do not have a plan. And we take that into account. And also, fixed costs is something we're always looking at. Places that have, high pension burdens that they can't get out of, high debt, they have much harder time responding to climate trends or climate shocks in their region. One thing I did want to make sure I point out is that in the United States, there's a level of government support for climate change issues that doesn't exist in other places. In that chart where I had the heat map, regional and local governments in developing countries are at a medium, I think medium-low risk. We're at low risk at regional and local governments in developed countries. And that's because of the government coverage. So here, state governments tend to watch out for their local government. Oops, finally did that. Yeah. And, you know, the federal government has FEMA, which, you know, reimburses governments for these climate events. And so this coverage really helps things out here in the United States. Before I open it up for questions, just a couple of things we've done recently that might be of interest. We did a survey at the beginning of this year that we sent to the 50 largest debt holders in the United States, or the entities that have issued the most debt, the 50 largest in the United States. We got responses from about 30 of them. And it was really interesting that of the responses, I believe it was about 45% had some sort of a sustainability plan in place already. Some of them were working on it, and it was about 87% said they would have a sustainability plan by the end of this year. We asked, you know, how many projects there were. There were a total of about 270 projects on these 28 cities' books. The projects cost about $47 billion. We asked them who was going to pay for it. And they said that they have about $26 billion of that in their own budgets as capital outlays, and they expected the other $20 billion or so to come from either the federal or state government or somebody else. Another thing, they mentioned that 60% of the projects were flood-related projects. So that seems to be the major thing that most issuers are concerned about. And, you know, 42% of the U.S. population, you know, lives in coastal zones, you know, which is an issue because I think 8 trillion or 48% of our nation's GDP comes from these coastal communities. And another thing that we've done recently is we've just acquired a company called 427. 427 is a data company. It's based in California, and they have lots of data that we can use to determine exposure. So when we first started this, the only thing we found to help us determine exposure was hazard mitigation plans. We kind of you know, went and looked them up. You have to have a mitigation plan in order to get reimbursed from FEMA, so everybody has one. Even if the city didn't have it itself, the county would include the cities in its. So that was some basic information to start with, and we've been trying to improve the data and metrics that we start with. And so we moved from there to Moody's Analytics, one of our sister companies. They had some good data on water and heat stress, and we were including those in our analyst packages for a while. Now we're going to be including the data from 427. They have 5 metrics that they look at, and they have a big, deep database that goes down to every city with 5,000 people or more. So now we're taking that data to start with to help show the exposure of our entities and help guide our analysts in the questions to ask. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions.
Yes. So as a municipality, I'm an elected official in the city of Norfolk. We are second only to New Orleans in terms of flood risk, you heard earlier. We have major programs, engineering plans for stormwater as well as tidal flooding issues that we can't finance because our debt capacity is such that we're limited. And we don't want to go above our debt capacity because we don't want to go to Moody's and get slapped on the wrist for doing mitigation work. Can you talk about the tension between trying to be proactive to mitigate future risk and the potential of being downgraded for your credit rating?
I suppose there's tension if your resources are limited. And if you have limited resources, you need to manage them. And so you could either, spend more money on your mitigation. Your borrowing costs will go up if it reduces your credit profile, but, you have to make that determination whether it's worth it doing that, or would you rather have a higher credit rating, borrow money, more cheaply, then, you can only support so much of that activity.
Completely understand, and but would you want to invest in a municipality that is being proactive and addressing future climate change risk? Is there some benefit to that? I guess I'm wondering, could that be, I think the lens might need to change as we look at these severe climate trends, climate shocks, climate risks. And I was just wondering if there is any discussion about that, of basically being positively affected if we are going to be proactive about that. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so, we're a regulated credit rating agency, so we can't really give advice. So, no, I can't really give you advice on that. But from what we see, it's a tough choice. But climate change is regional. It doesn't really recognize boundaries. So we see areas that are poor. I mean, they can barely, keep their streets together and provide the general services, public safety type services that their constituents need. But they're in a region, so the surrounding cities or counties that may be a lot more wealthy recognize that they can't spend money on climate change adaptation and push it all to their next door neighbor, or if the next door neighbor doesn't do anything, it doesn't help anybody. So, we've heard earlier today, and we tend to see regional groups get together, and I think a lot of these regional groups have, cities with less resources that are part of them, they're active, and, that's how I see movement in this. Yes. Yes.
So you heard earlier discussion about how difficult it is to value ecosystem services and the benefits, the mitigation benefits of green infrastructure, et cetera. You mentioned, if I heard you correctly, that it's not that you take into account climate change per se, it's that your analysts go and look at the economic stability of a locality, let's say, a municipality, and I guess the measures that they've undertaken. But how do you look at that and value those and decide what's the most beneficial measure that they've undertaken, or they should be doing more? If the rest of us are talking about we can't value it, how do you all do that?
We can't value it either. So,
I was afraid you were going to say that.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure anybody's really, valuing that. So at this point, we want to hear that you recognize you're exposed, and we want to hear that you have a plan for dealing with that exposure. We keep track of that data and what you say. It's non-public information, so we don't spread it out, but we keep track of it. And eventually, we'll get to the point where we notice issuers said they were doing X. They say they're working on it. It's been 5 years. Nothing seems to have happened. Or it's been 5 years and it didn't seem to work. Now they're switching and they're moving in another direction. This other place said they were working on something. It's been 5 years. Wow, they really documented how they've achieved benefits from this ever since they've done it. So, we really have to keep data, keep, everything that we hear, and then evaluate it as we go forward. But right now, we don't have a way to put numbers to those.
One measure being better than another, you're looking at.
You're correct. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned FEMA, and I'm
Yes.
just curious how FEMA factors in, because I know of a community on the Eastern Shore that's still waiting for FEMA to kick in from their last storm.
Right. So FEMA provides reimbursement for lots of money that's spent to recover from these climate events. It may take 2 or 3 or 4 years, which is why I said you need liquidity, and it really affects your fiscal stability if you have one of these events and you don't have liquidity or you don't have any room to borrow money because you have to wait. Now, I've seen a state government loan the city government money until they get their reimbursement from FEMA, but, I'm not sure if you could depend on that or not either. But the ultimate backstop is that you will get, 90% of your money repaid by FEMA, even if it takes 4 years. And that's a much better financial position to be in than the place that has to spend its own money to recover. Okay. Over there.
Now that you've got 427. Sir. Yeah, excuse me, I'm sorry. Now that you've got the data from 427, how do you expect to use that, and how do you think it's going to change your analytical process and your risk evaluations?
So what we want to use that data for is to inform us. So the first place we're using it is to inform our analysts as to who's exposed, which issuers have exposure to which type of climate subfactors. And so we're just getting kind of access to 427's data. So the first research piece that we wrote was one looking at their data related to heat and where they see heat stress coming in the future. We laid on top of it our ratings portfolio, our public finance ratings portfolio, so that we could see which of our rated entities are most exposed, which areas of the country are most exposed. And, that was an interesting piece. It showed that the Midwest, right around Illinois, Missouri, is highly exposed to heat stress, which we, might not have thought about just looking at it straight away. And the reason why is that, we know it's hot in Arizona and Florida and other places, but the way that their metrics work, they're looking at the biggest change in degree and the, absence of cooling days. So it's really a forward-looking view. But it enables us to see that we should really worry about heat, in the Midwest as opposed to in Arizona. And we expect to do that with all the metrics that 427 has. Sure. All right, I think I'm out of town. Thank you, everybody.